Welcome to everybody, and we will begin our lecture of the day with the art of architecture with your resident French, Radji. Last time I came to give a lecture, it was on how to make sound effects. But you will soon see that the way I do my architecture is very different from the way I do my sound effects. First thing to know, when I say architecture, is not only the background buildings or the background of a panel in a comics with the interior of a room. Half of the time, it's also come to the general construction of your panel and the harmony of everything in it. For the sake of example, I'm going to show you how I typically begin drawing a panel with a background of the city and some characters in it. You have to think of your panel as organically as possible, because the logic of a living body help a lot when it comes to drawing architecture, because when you think of it as a skeleton with a solid base articulated with some fleshy exterior, somehow it makes sense. I'm going to make something very simple to begin with. You'll draw a very rough shape of what you want. Something very rough you really don't have to make it complicated or anything. When you have that rough, we begin to draw the skeleton. Always remember that when you use shapes like cubes, like rectangles, and spheres, it is only bones, and those bones have to be joined between them with some kind of logics. Here I'm going to draw some ruined house. I will first draw a very simple cube to give me some idea of the proportions, and I will do that. I will do a little pillar to represent the space occupied by my character. And from there, I will draw the furthest background. It's more detailed, but it will still remain rough. You will do some shapes to decide on what it will be later. Because first and foremost, you're going to focus on what is on the foreground. When you have your foreground decided, you can also add some shade to give you a better idea of what is farthest or your point of view. It's very important to remember that what makes a building, what makes a shack, a house, or a shop realistic are at the same time little details that will give it life, and very rough shapes will help you add those little details more easily. Always think with a 3D image of your creation. Remember that it has volume and that it has space that it is occupying right now in your panel. Let's say that it is missing a part, for example. should still present features that remind your audience that it is not a flat picture. Never hesitate to use shades and solid ink, solid blacks, or darker color if you want to do it in the coloring phase to signify the sense of perspective in your construction. At this point, you will notice I'm not giving a particular attention to the exactitude of perspective because I'm still at this point I'm still deciding what my building will look like. When you are roughly at this point, when you have enough shapes that you will easily remember how your building is supposed to look like, you can stay at that, then you will now give attentions to your character. I'm going to do something very simple. You must remember that the character must have a size and proportion that will not make him an anomaly inside of the setting you're doing for him. For example, here, if your character is a bit tall for the rest, please use the selection tool, play with the size and rectify it. That way, when you will add other characters, you will use this one as a reference. Still drawing both shapes at this point with stickmen, and you will draw more precise forms for the background. Nothing too detailed for the moment. You will make cubes and rectangle and these sort of things, or sticks. You can add, if it's a street view, you can add a sidewalk, still in the roof shapes. Different object if you wish to. At this point, you should have a very good idea of where you're going. And with enough detail so that you are not lost and you're beginning the realization of the foreground and the background. I'm going to lower the opacity and we will go to the next step. At this point, you have your shapes that will aid you for the realization of your backgrounds. Now you must decide on the textures that you will add to give personality to your building, because you must add them, incorporate them at the same time where you are drawing the buildings themselves. For example, this building right there is supposed to be a damaged stores, a damaged shop, something like that. Using what I draw before, I will begin to give it some of its final shapes. remember that ordinary in ordinary urban masonry, bricks are often used for a basis of big solid buildings. That is not always the case. So for some buildings, if you draw some bricks under some kind of plaster, it can work. But you can also do something as simple as little marks like this that will we simply simulate the porosity of stone and concrete that is simply eroded by time or rain or snow, etc. Every little details that you will add to your buildings will tell a story about it. For the sake, right here, for the sake of the lecture, I will incorporate as many details as possible to show you the possibility. Because there is a lot of things that will affect your buildings, because the time, erosions, sometimes that you will notice when you walk in the street that there's a number of things on the walls that will give it some kind of personality. Be it cracks, be it irregularities inside of the stone, of the masonry. Does it have torn up stickers and flyers on it? Does it have some sort of marks made by the rain, etc.? And keep in mind that it is still a three-dimensional realization. If you have bricks that are showing, you must be mindful of the places where it shows. If you have characters that interact with your building, you must take some referentials to not be lost with their size. For example, my door right here will be the reference I use to draw any character who is very close to this particular shop. Batman here, for example. For the windows and doors, you must always picture yourself inside of the room and tell yourself at what level should the windows be. It is a window that I have to. It is the window a normal window with the bottom of it more or less at hip level with you, or is it the kind of window where it is more or less at the same height as your head? In this case, it will be much smaller than a regular window. I'm going to show you two examples. Let's say there is a small window here. It will be more or less at this height. Just give it a broken window for good measure. A regular window in a building would be more or less at this level. Let's draw it that way here. Let's say there was a window here. Broken glass. It is still damaged building. Another thing you can add to your buildings that you will often see in urban area is that there is some works of masonry that separate the wall from ground, and most of the time it is a very it is the part of the building who is the most affected by the running water on the street when it rains, for example. Regular buildings in a urban area, like shops and stores, are not that high in height. Most of the time it is like 3 to 4, let's say 5 meters in height at most. So there is no use drawing a very tall tower when you simply do in a shop. You can do something that is lower than a regular house. A regular house most of the time will be 2 times the size of the store, because in urban areas where the space available is much more scarce than in the countryside, the buildings are typically built in height rather than in length. So keep that in mind when we will draw the background. When you want to simulate damage on a wall, don't make anything too complicated at first. You will do some kind of shape first, then you will come back to it later. Do it roughly like that. Then when that is done, in this case of this damaged building, begin to do some shapes that indicate the other end of the shop. This. And here we are going to play with the shapes. There was a window here, so when a building is damaged, most of the time you will see damage that will follow the places where the windows are, because it's weaknesses in the wall, more or less. Yes. The goal here is to make it evident that there was a window here, but the parts of the wall that are now gone still more or less follow the shape of the window. When you are done with the general shape of the building, you can begin adding some depth to it. It is so that you remember where it is, and you can play with it later, because at this point we are not done. When a building is damaged, most of the time there is cracks that still goes on inside of the structure that follow very geometrical shapes, but also circular. It's like a broken window or a broken windshield on a car. Impact kind of make a circle, but the circle is made of squares and rectangles, triangles, everything with angles. It's like a spider web. Some of them goes farther, some of them goes not that much inside of the brickwork. You can also make dents in the building that indicate that chunks of the building were taken off but not completely gone. At this point, you have a good enough shapes that you can play with it later, and you can add all sorts of details on it. I do recommend that you try to think extensively about the kind of buildings you want or the kind of place you want to depict before you begin doing your roof, but it is still the same principle. At this point, it is more than enough to draw what you want on it later. So we have the other characters all around it, hiding their business. The trash can here. As for the backgrounds, the advantage you have on them that the farthest they are from your point of view, the more simple in shapes they can be. You often see in comics, for example, that buildings are like this kind of very, very simple shapes with like those kind of shapes here is like a very classic skyscraper. But that's not something I do personally most of the time, or that I avoid doing, because if you do too much of it, it's kind of lazy. What you can do is use shapes again with the same logic of telling a story. Let's say that this tall tower we see is a residential tower with a lot of people living in it. It's very simple shapes, very simple squares and rectangle. Once again, the thing is, you're trying to simulate the different floors, the numerous floors, because since it's a tower, a residential tower is meant to house a lot of people at the same time. At this point in the drawing, you do not have to add things like elevations, antenna, or things hanging by the balcony. It's a bit too early for that. You can do it later. For now, you focus on the shapes. when you play with the shapes of the building, you can differentiate the buildings from a distance. As I used this tower to make a residential area, is not that mean that in the storytelling of your scene, you can make more tower or more buildings that looks like apartment buildings all around, or you can make things like small businesses like you will see in a big street, like our shop here. It is damaged. To add more personality to your buildings and not simply make copies of the same things, you can add things at the ground level, like a barrier, different doors, make more different ways to put the windows on the facade. You can even make very different shape on the building. What I'm going to do here is do something a bit similar to the tower in the background. Keep in mind that most of the time you will try to do buildings that you see in your everyday life when you come to the general shapes. It's something I recommend is that when you want to get ideas for your buildings and backgrounds, you go take a walk. You make some Google search if you cannot take a walk, and because you are because of the current situation, you know what I'm talking about. You will do a quick research on the kind of buildings around your place where you live, get some inspiration, and see how things are done in your own city. It's a good place to begin. Here I'm drawing a place where there's a separation of two different apartments. There's little details you can add. For example, some kind of balcony. Windows, large panels of windows, maybe separated, a place indicating that there is a strong point in the structure where you cannot take windows. Maybe here you can draw a fence. You can also decide if there's things on the top, because there's some buildings where you can have access to the top of the buildings. There's also buildings where you cannot. It's up to you to decide what you want to do with it. Just be reminded that if you decide that for one reason or another the top floor is accessible, you must draw something like that indicates that it is accessible by either an elevator or a staircase, and there is some kind of way to prevent people from falling down. This when you are already at the background, any the other shapes that signify other buildings behind it, you can do it like this. You make shapes, very simple shapes. What are we going to do here? Here we are going to do a building who is thinner at the front, but larger in its length. Some windows here. One thing you can do in urban area are very little things like climatization machines that generally are put in dual ways on the outside. Again, you make we're going to make some additional shapes to indicate that it is either a very densely populated area or a more sparsely populated area. So you will have to decide if you add the shapes to give the impression that every available space was taken by a building. You will roughly draw the sidewalk. Maybe add some place where you will draw the public lighting, street lighting. Another interesting detail you can add in your urban background are the electrical lines, which are most of the time put in elevated area. It's really not complicated. You just do some T shapes and a number of lines. You can correct the direction of the lines later. At this point, you can add all the other details, like advertisement panels, direction panels. You have to decide where to put them, how they appears, the directions. You do not have to write anything on them for the moment. You just have to remember that they are there. But it's really at the very end of the process. Then lines on the floor. Maybe if here it's a cross, it's a crossing, you can add maybe a signalization light that is hanging from somewhere. Add those details at the very end because you must have drawn all the other stuff first. Okay. At this point, you have a very solid pencils of your urban backgrounds. I will not show you the inking process because here I'm really mostly showing you how to build the environment around your characters. So for now, we're going to put that all on one layer to show you the next example. Mm. To remember. Next, I'm going to show you how to make an aerial view of a city easier to do without resorting to simply repeating same shapes over and over. Once again, you're going to show a very rough view of the horizon. You will begin with the horizon. Because if you decide of the line of horizon first, it will greatly facilitate your work. Let's say that we are going to draw an harbor city. So we will need some place that will simulate an harbor. For good measure, let's say it will be shaped like this. So like in the first example, you will draw very rough shapes of what you want to do, but since it's supposed to be watched from a great distance, you will be able to see the shapes of city blocks. That's one very important detail when you draw a city seen from afar. City blocks shapes the way the city will look like. So make very rough shapes, very rough delimitations with spaces that must stimulate the very big avenue, the big streets of your city. Most of them are very simple. These lines that will sometimes cross. You do not have to do anything very complicated for this one. you will begin to make some cubes, very simple cubes. Those cubes will not represent building. For the moment, they represent zones. Some more, some more. When you have some cubes, some amount of cubes that represent different area, you will open another layer and you will begin to draw some shapes following the methods that I've told you about when doing backgrounds. For example, in the case of the harbor, the farther from the harbor you are, the more you can make buildings that are shapes like apartment buildings, for example. And the closest you are to the harbor, you will have to draw structures that remind you of an industrial yard or something like that. You shall begin with the farthest area, but the farthest area from the harbor, but the closest to you. You'll have to draw buildings very differently because they are seen from above. You have to show what's on the buildings. And most of the time, what's on the buildings, chimneys in the case of the oldest house. There's also the access, top access, some barriers, maybe some ventilation systems. I put on the top. Maybe a water cistern. Once again, to give some sense of reality, some sort of personality in your backgrounds, you must add very unique details that you must avoid repeating too often, that you can distribute in the space to give a sense of coherence. Remember that you must not draw buildings too close to each other because there's people walking in the streets and they must have some space to navigate the streets. Remember that. It's very important because you yourself can imagine how difficult it would be for someone if they had to live in a place where you cannot drive at all or walk to get somewhere. Also, when you draw your buildings, when you begin to draw your buildings, you must also remember that they are not on the same level. They are not as tall as the others. It's trickier to draw that because you must first draw some area where they are taller. Also, you must remember that the farthest from your point of view, the smaller building become. And even if you can use the most simplest shapes do your buildings, do try to put some variations on the way they are disposed, so that you do not have to repeat patterns too often. In the case of towers that are very far from you, you can do the most simple shapes to indicate their presence, but it is only if they are very, very far from you. If they are closer, will have if they are closer to you, you will have to add some details on them. When you arrive at places like the harbor or an industrial yard, buildings are most of the time houses, evidently. They are very espaced from each other. They are prefabricated also most of the time. So you can espace them, you can draw little things between them. You do not really know to know more than that. In fact, you do not need to apply much things to make your drawings more detailed, more organized. You just follow everything I told you. At this point, you should do great. Because I'm not showing you the part where you are supposed to ink everything, but when you are drawing cities like this, it's a lot of details and it is very time consuming. When you draw comics for Entervoid and that you have a deadline to respect, very short deadline to respect, you have to keep in mind that you will have after that to ink all of that. So if you, I know that some of us like to put details, but the trick is you can put a lot of details, but at the right places. The area closer to you in the event of such a view right there are places closer to your point of view. You can put more time and effort to put lots more details in it. But the farther you go, the less the less important the details are. But that doesn't mean you have to be negligent about it. Also, remember that it's a city, so there will be cars circulating. You do very simple shapes to represent that. And when you represent where the cars go, you also have to remind you that roads in the city are like the vascular system in your body, only with more angles. follow the shapes of the city blocks. Also remember that in these sort of angles that I'm showing you, perspective is much more important to follow here, because lines of horizons are what are one of the two big elements that are shaping your city. You will be able to correct any early mistakes during inking, or when you rework, your sketching. Do keep in mind that if you deviate too much from the line of horizon, it will be much more complicated for you to go back to it later. Oh, I said that it was an arbor, so it must be boats. Play with the size of the boats, of the construction, to give some sense of dimensions. Far first it is from your point of view, you can resort to the simplest shapes, but there must be some other shape that separate them from the rest. When you are drawing a city, you must remember all these little details: the shapes, the adjustments of the buildings, the way they interact with each other. City city is as much organic as is it geometrical. While you use geometrical shapes to give it life, you must remember that it is a function, that it is working with a certain kind of logic, that it is meant to have people living in it. If you can remember that kind of detail, you will have an easier time drawing your cities. Remember that people live in it, that it is ever a living space or a working space. So there must be spaces between the different area to allow people to move, to circulate. I will give you a last little trick before calling it over. When you draw the inside of a room, the inside of a room is not that different from drawing a city block or a city in general. You just have to remember that it is made for someone to move inside, have access to everything, and go wherever he please. But since the proportions are not the same, because contrary to the first case here, where there is multiple people who can be shown, or the second case where you can suggest there are people because of the means of transportation and the way the buildings are drawn. Inside of the room, it is much more evident because most of the time you will draw at most a handful of characters in it. In the event of an office, for example, most of the time, the shape of the room you're drawing, it will fatally be a piece of it outside of your panel. One technique that can help you draw it better is that you do not hesitate. Imagine that you have another panel just next to it. Do not hesitate when you are still in the sketching rough storyboard part of your drawing. You can still overlap some of the shapes to help you. Let's say it's an open office, like you will see a lot of time, like you will see a lot in movies, in comics, etc. It's a place that is divided in spaces so that different people can have their space to work, evidently. It is also a place where people must still be able to move rather easily, to have access to everything around them, to be able to stand, to go to the copy machine, or to go to take themselves a coffee. So you, much like big city blocks that are adjacent so that people can walk and drive a car between them, an office must be adjacent so that people can move around, are still close to each other. They must be able to move around and follow that shape, that square shape. There must be enough space so that a regular person can walk with another person next to them. There's room to go to the other parts of the building. Maybe there's a maybe there's a fountain just here. Inside of each individual block, you will have to draw a person or not, if you are not there. And remember that it is still kind of a building. You have to respect different kind of shapes. And much like I've been telling you for the past hour, If you apply all the technique I've told you for drawing buildings, you will be able to draw the insides of building rather easily. Like in a real open space, you can make each space very different to represent the personality of the person working there, the different ways they organize their working space or the different occupation they have. Some interaction. Let's say that there's this guy who is watching what this guy is doing, clicking on the advancement. Another guy who is talking, is walking. The copy machine, you can draw it better later. If you apply all I've told you about a building for drawing the design of a room, you will have no problem applying the same methods. Those are very simple methods, but they are the basis of everything else. Before trying to make very complicated angles, very complicated buildings, very complicated scenes, you must be aware of all the rules I've told you. It will help you do. It would help you improve on the way you will draw your characters interacting with the environment. It will improve giving some expression of life in your drawing. If you are able to draw scenes like this one, rather than simply doing panels with characters who speak and do things with a flat color background, it will be much more alive, much more believable if you can just after that draw these kind of things to indicate where your character is, what they're doing, etc. I think it will be all for this lecture. It's much shorter than the last one I did, because here I wanted to give you much simpler tools that are applicable in a variety of shots and angles in comics making. If you apply what I told you for any kind of patterns, of scenes that require you to draw your characters inside of a set environment, in a room, in a city, in the street, you will be able to do it if you remember all of those rules I've told you. Okay, well, that concludes my lecture. And next time I will try to make you a lecture about horrors and not safe for work things. So I do not know what solution we have for those kind of things. I will try to discuss with the admin of moderators to know what my options are, because I really want to teach you about drawing monsters and those kind of things.